from their home or imprisoned or tortured for expressing their beliefs. No one can understand why the soil their parents tilled has turned to desert, or why their skills have become useless and their families left hungry. People know that these challenges cannot be met by one country alone or by the government alone. Change cannot be held back by frontiers. Human progress has always come from individual and local initiatives, freely devised and then freely adapted elsewhere, end quotes. Of course, the IPS had been telling the same story since its founding, but the stories of the developing world are not easy to tell. They are complex and they do not lend themselves to easy headlines. And this has been successfully exploited as an advantage by the developed countries that have relied on their global media companies to tell their side of the story. Even those of us serving in the United Nations have often been reduced to searching for the morning headlines in the newspapers, radios, or television to find out which issues we're supposed to support or oppose. Even in our own capitals, they are reduced to learning about issues being debated in the UN from the perspective of the international media companies of the developed world that often are used to set the agenda even here at the UN. It has therefore been helpful and even refreshing that Kofi Annan was available to tell the other side of the global story that often was not in line with the accepted international consensus carefully cultivated by the major powers using their international media companies. One big story that will always be associated with Kofi Annan is on the reform and revitalization of the United Nations that he began soon after assuming office 10 years ago. Of course, renewing an intergovernmental organization such as the United Nations was bound to be complicated and difficult. But Kofi Annan never shied away from the difficult and complicated issues. Personally, I believe that Kofi Annan was driven by his commitment to the Charter of the United Nations, especially the determination set out by the peoples of the world who adopted the Charter more than 60 years ago. In part, the Charter states that they are determined to reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Throughout his reform proposals, Kofi Annan not only kept faith with the fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, but he promoted gender equality at every level in the organization, despite the bureaucratic challenges he faced in the UN system. The fact that today many people expect the Secretary General designate, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, to appoint women among his senior advisors, including a Deputy Secretary General who may be a woman, is precisely to live up to the standard set by Kofi Annan. Millions of people who live on less than $1 a day are anxiously waiting to see how much of the Millennium Development Goals will ever be met in their own lifetimes. That is thanks to Kofi Annan. Policymakers now accept that security has to be linked to development, and both can only be guaranteed by the implementation of human rights and the rule of law. That is also thanks to Kofi Annan. Yet, one reform that the Secretary General Kofi Annan has always promoted but has received less attention than it deserves. That is the expansion and the reform of the Security Council in both permanent and non-permanent categories. While member states have failed to achieve this reform during Kofi Annan's term, I am among those that believe this issue will in the near future receive the attention it requires. Meanwhile, whenever people around the world read about any crisis or any disaster, whether it is beyond the situation in Iraq, the deteriorating humanitarian conditions in Darfur, or the suffering of people in Lebanon or Gaza, they accept such reports, but only believe them after having heard Kofi Annan's side of the same story. I believe this is one of the reasons that the IPS has concluded that Secretary General Kofi Annan deserves its International Achievement Award for 2006. For the rest of us, we are just pleased and honored to have been present at such an important occasion. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kumalo. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador, of course, has outlined for you many of the reasons why we in IPS have chosen the Secretary General to be the recipient of this year's International Achievement Award. And obviously, we are extremely pleased that he has accepted that invitation because, as you are all aware, the Secretary General has not only presided over this organization throughout one of the most complex periods of international diplomacy, but he has, during that period, remained steadfastly committed to the principles of the Charter, to the role of the United Nations in peace and security, and also in development. And most interestingly for us, from the perspective of IPS, has been his understanding of the role of media and communication in communicating the message of that complex diplomacy, and he has done it with great skill. And sometimes some of the things that we write, he perhaps is not too pleased with them, but of course that is the nature of the job. We in IPS have for decades been committed to telling the story beneath the story. And it is therefore with great pleasure that I invite our Director General, Mario Lebetkin, to explain further why we have chosen the Secretary General and also to talk a little bit more about IPS. Mario Lebetkin has been with IPS since 1979, and he has been Director General. He's the third Director General of the agency since 2002. He is a journalist who brings tremendous skill to the craft, but he's also committed to the principles of human development, because we don't believe that journalism is, as it were, we're not political eunuchs. We tell real stories about real people, and that is the role of IPS. And it is with great pleasure that I invite our Director General, Mario Lebetkin, to address the meeting.